There is a specific moment in any professional relationship when trust doesn't collapse loudly but instead thins, becoming translucent, then brittle, then functionally irrelevant. In my case, that moment arrived not through an argument or a missed payment or even an overt betrayal, but through silence. Clients stopped replying. Calendars emptied. Invoices that had been routine for years began to stall in accounts payable limbo, awaiting approvals that never came. At first, I treated this as background noise. Markets fluctuate, decision makers rotate, but patterns, when viewed longitudinally, rarely lie. Over a 6-week interval, 13 clients, mid-market entities with complex tax exposure and a long history with my firm, transitioned their advisory relationships elsewhere. No exit interviews, no formal notices, just a quiet migration. The destination, I learned later, was not a competitor in the traditional sense. It was a newly incorporated advisory firm, aggressively branded, staffed leanly, and led by my former partner. The partnership dissolution itself had been uneventful on paper. We separated equity, dissolved shared operating entities, and executed a mutual non-solicitation clause that was, at the time, reassuringly explicit. It prohibited direct outreach, indirect inducement, and any form of client interference for a defined cooling-off period. Standard language, enforceable, boring. Which is precisely why it worked, until it didn't. Under the weight of this realization, unsettling was the calm with which I initially responded. Shock in professionals often manifests as administrative diligence. I requested engagement letters, I reviewed CRM logs, I reconstructed communication trails, and slowly the picture clarified. No emails, no calls, no explicit pitches, just availability, coincidental lunches, casual disclosures, plausible deniability perfected to an art form. From a legal standpoint, it was irritating. From a strategic one, it was fascinating. Because what he had done was not illegal in the conventional sense. It was, instead, optimally adjacent to illegality, positioned just beyond the reach of most civil remedies, particularly given the evidentiary burden required to prove inducement absent explicit solicitation. Litigation would be expensive, protracted, and uncertain. Worse, it would be public. And public fights, particularly in advisory industries, tend to destroy value indiscriminately. So I did what analysts do when direct confrontation is inefficient. I zoomed out. I examined his new firm not as a moral failure, but as a system. Its structure, its capital stack, its compliance posture, its timing. New firms, especially those built rapidly on transferred relationships, often inherit more than clients. They inherit assumptions, shortcuts, unexamined risk, and sometimes, though rarely acknowledged, they inherit liabilities embedded in the tax code itself. The breach, then, was not merely personal, it was structural. And structures, unlike people, do not respond to appeals, they respond to pressure. Client migration is usually framed as a marketing problem. In reality, it is a compliance problem disguised as growth. When accounts move quickly, when revenue concentrates early, and when documentation lags behind operational reality, firms begin to operate on borrowed time, particularly in regulated environments where historical continuity matters. My former partner's firm exhibited all the classic indicators of accelerated fragility. 90-day revenue curves that exceeded rational onboarding capacity. Engagement letters standardized too aggressively. Jurisdictional overlap that suggested convenience rather than optimization. And most telling of all, a peculiar confidence in their tax positioning. Confident not because it had been tested, but because it hadn't. This is a common error. New firms often mistake absence of scrutiny for validation. They equate speed with legitimacy. They confuse momentum with compliance. The IRS, notably, does not.
I began mapping the client transitions against filing calendars, entity elections, and reporting thresholds. The exercise was less forensic than architectural. I wasn't looking for fraud, I was looking for stress points, areas where the system bent under its own assumptions. One such area involved the handling of legacy depreciation schedules inherited from prior advisory relationships. Another involved the reclassification of pass-through income under revised internal accounting policies that, while facially reasonable, created reporting inconsistencies across tax years. Individually, these were trivial. Collectively, they formed a pattern. And patterns, especially when they cross entity boundaries, attract attention. There exists within the U.S. tax code a collection of provisions so old, so context-specific, that they survive primarily because they are inconvenient to repeal. They are rarely invoked, rarely litigated, rarely taught, but they remain enforceable, dormant like a clause in an insurance policy nobody expects to read until a claim is filed. My analysis did not begin with these provisions. It arrived at them naturally, through elimination. Standard remedies failed. Civil enforcement was noisy. Arbitration was toothless without discovery. Regulatory complaints lacked jurisdictional clarity. But tax law, particularly at the federal level, has a different posture. It does not require motive. It does not require harm. It requires inconsistency. The illusion of legitimacy that surrounded the new firm was built on narrative coherence, branding, messaging, client testimonials. But beneath that surface, the operational story was fragmented. Different entities telling different versions of the same financial truth. Different filings implying different realities. Not maliciously, carelessly. And carelessness in tax law is not neutral, it is actionable. I want to be precise here. Nothing that followed was retaliatory in the emotional sense. It was corrective. When a professional violates a non-solicitation agreement, exploits relational capital, and accelerates growth without stabilizing compliance, they are not merely unethical, they are reckless. And recklessness in advisory businesses deserves consequences. That is my professional judgment, and I stand by it. What mattered next was timing, because dormant codes, like dormant risks, only activate when conditions align, and those conditions were assembling quietly, invisibly, with the patience of bureaucracy itself. In the next phase, I stopped observing. I prepared alignment.
The misconception about tax law, particularly among fast-growing professional firms, is that its danger lies in complexity. It does not. Complexity can be managed. Specialists exist for that. The real danger lies in neglect, in the quiet corners of the code that survive precisely because they are unfashionable, inconvenient, and commercially uninteresting. Some provisions exist not to punish wrongdoing, but to correct asymmetry. They were written for edge cases, transitional entities, and structural inconsistencies that lawmakers once feared would be exploited en masse, and then largely forgot. Over time, these provisions faded from active practice, relegated to footnotes in continuing education materials and rarely cited memoranda. Rarely cited does not mean obsolete. As I traced the internal logic of my former partner's firm, its entity sequencing, its inherited client structures, its rapid assumption of advisory responsibility across jurisdictions, I noticed something subtle and faintly archaic. A mismatch between historical reporting obligations and present representations. Not incorrect in isolation, but discordant in aggregate, like a chord that resolves incorrectly yet passes unnoticed by the untrained ear. It was, I admit, almost elegant in its negligence. The dormant provision I identified was not a cynical loophole in the cinematic sense. It offered no clever escape,
no aggressive deduction, no exotic shelter. Instead, it functioned as a conditional amplifier. When specific thresholds were crossed, timing, continuity, advisory responsibility, it quietly expanded the scope of review. Not automatically, not publicly, but decisively. Most professionals never encounter it because they never trigger it, and those who do often assume coincidence. What made this provision particularly potent was not its severity, but its indifference. It did not care about intent. It did not require a complaint. It did not ask who benefited. It asked only whether the narrative presented to the tax authority was internally consistent over time. In this case, it was not. The firm's legitimacy depended on a seamless transition story. Clients chose to move. Advisory services continued. Nothing material changed. But structurally, everything had changed. New entities, new responsibility chains, new interpretations layered atop old filings. The story was coherent. The data was not. There is a professional vanity in believing that regulators operate like adversaries, strategizing and scheming. In reality, they operate like archivists. They notice discrepancies because discrepancies interrupt order. And order in tax administration is sacred. By the time I completed my analysis, I had no sense of triumph, only clarity. The system did not need persuasion. It needed alignment. And alignment, once achieved, tends to cascade. The move, then, was not aggressive. It was quiet, almost deferential, the kind of action that, when taken, feels anticlimactic until its effects propagate. In the next phase, the code ceased being theoretical. It encountered geography. Jurisdiction is where abstractions become consequences. A firm can narrate itself convincingly in marketing materials, investor decks, even internal governance documents. But jurisdictional boundaries, state, federal, international, do not care about narrative coherence. They care about allocation, about authority, about which entity said what, when, and under whose responsibility. My former partner's firm operated across multiple states within its first year, an ambitious posture that would have been admirable had it been accompanied by proportional compliance infrastructure. Instead, it relied on inherited assumptions, prior nexus determinations, legacy filing positions, and a generalized belief that advisory continuity implied regulatory continuity. It does not. The friction emerged where filings overlapped, where one jurisdiction implicitly contradicted another, not overtly, but through timing and classification. These were not red flags in isolation. They were yellow flags in chorus. The dormant provision I had identified functioned precisely here. It did not accuse, it connected. It allowed disparate filings, once sufficiently inconsistent, to be reviewed as a unified sequence rather than discrete events. This is an unglamorous power, but a devastating one. When that connection was made, the system responded as designed, slowly, methodically, without emotion. The first indication was not dramatic. There was no knock, no call, no warning shot. There was merely a request, one that referenced prior years, adjacent entities, and assumptions that the firm believed were settled. It was phrased politely, bureaucratically, almost kindly. But embedded within it was scope. This is where many firms make their final error. They treat initial contact as informational rather than directional. They respond narrowly. They explain instead of contextualizing. They assume the inquiry is local, when in fact it is relational. Under the weight of this misinterpretation, exposed with the firm's internal fragility, compliance functions that had been sufficient at inception now strained. Documentation that existed in theory but not in practice became urgently necessary. Advisors accustomed to proactive positioning found themselves reactive, and reactivity is expensive. What followed was not immediate collapse, but deceleration. Client onboarding paused. Capital allocation shifted toward defense. Conversations changed tone. Reputational gravity asserted itself. Firms do not need to be found guilty to be found risky. At this point, my involvement ceased. The system had engaged. Outcomes would follow according to its own logic, not mine. It is tempting to frame this moment as checkmate. It was not. Checkmate implies intention. This was inevitability. When professionals conflate speed with substance, narrative with structure, and growth with legitimacy, they invite scrutiny not because they are envied, but because they are incoherent. And incoherence in regulated systems is intolerable. Compliance is usually discussed as a defensive posture, a cost center, a drag coefficient applied to otherwise efficient growth. That framing is convenient, but it is also naive. Compliance, properly understood, is neither passive nor neutral. It is leverage. What unfolded inside my former partner's firm was not a failure of intelligence or expertise. It was a failure of sequencing. Growth preceded stabilization. Revenue preceded governance. Narrative preceded documentation. And once the system began asking integrated questions, the firm discovered that its answers existed, but not in the same place, not in the same format, and not under the same authority. This is where compliance stops being administrative and starts being strategic. Each request from the authorities required internal reconciliation. Each reconciliation revealed another assumption that had gone untested. Advisors who had operated autonomously were suddenly required to coordinate. Historical decisions, once harmless, were reinterpreted through a present lens that was far less forgiving. And the cost was not merely financial. Compliance demands time. Time diverts attention. Attention diverted erodes confidence. Confidence erosion changes behavior. Clients sense it, employees internalize it. Partners begin to hedge. This is how firms unravel without a single dramatic event. I observed this phase at a distance with what I can only describe as detached fascination. Not because I derived pleasure from the outcome, but because the process was textbook. The firm had entered a state of defensive optimization, responding to inquiries, reallocating resources, delaying expansion, all while insisting publicly that nothing was wrong. Something always is. There is an unspoken rule in professional services. Once compliance begins to dominate internal conversation, growth has already ended. You may not know it yet, you may deny it vigorously, but the inflection point has passed. What made this moment particularly striking was the firm's insistence on treating the situation as temporary, a misunderstanding, a routine review, a matter to be cleared up. This language is common. It is also misleading. Systems do not clear up, they conclude. And conclusions, once reached, have memory. By the time the firm realized that compliance was no longer a background function, but the central axis of its operation, its optionality had narrowed. Strategic initiatives were shelved, hiring slowed, client conversations shifted from opportunity to reassurance. That shift is irreversible. It is worth stating plainly, this outcome was avoidable. A slower transition, a cleaner separation, a respect for structural continuity. Any of these would have diffused the risk. Instead, ambition outran architecture. In my professional opinion, that is not unfortunate, it is irresponsible. The mythology surrounding audits is cinematic. Agents arriving unannounced, documents seized, operations halted. Reality is less dramatic and far more consequential. Reality arrives by mail. The first letter did not accuse, it did not threaten. It requested clarification, specific clarification, referencing years that predated the firm's existence, entities it believed were irrelevant, and filings assumed to be final. It was, in its own way, beautifully indifferent. The letter's power lay not in what it said, but in what it implied.
continuity. It treated the firm not as a new entity, but as a successor, a continuation of responsibility rather than a fresh start. This reframing altered everything. Suddenly, prior decisions mattered again, prior pacifications, prior representations. Advisors who believed they had inherited only clients now inherited histories. Under the weight of this realization, faltered the firm's leadership posture. Confidence, once projected effortlessly, now required maintenance. Internal meetings multiplied. Legal counsel expanded its role. Responses were drafted, revised, escalated, and each response widened the aperture. This is the paradox of regulatory inquiry. Cooperation is mandatory, but completeness is dangerous. Every answer contextualizes another question. Every clarification invites a deeper review. The process is recursive. Clients, perceptive as ever, noticed the change. Meetings were postponed. Deliverables slowed. Assurance gave way to explanation. And explanation, in advisory relationships, is often interpreted as uncertainty. The firm did not collapse at this stage. That would have been merciful. Instead, it entered a prolonged state of constrained existence, operating, billing, responding, but no longer advancing. Capital, once allocated toward growth, was now reserved for contingencies. Reputation, once assumed, now required defense. This is the quiet cost of scrutiny. It does not destroy firms outright. It erodes them. At no point did I intervene further. There was nothing to do. The system had taken ownership. Outcomes would be determined by consistency, documentation, and endurance. I want to be explicit here because ambiguity invites misinterpretation. This was not revenge. Revenge is emotional, imprecise, and short-lived. This was consequence. When professionals exploit relational trust, bypass structural safeguards, and mistake momentum for legitimacy, they expose themselves to forces that do not negotiate. And those forces, once engaged, do not forget. Capital does not flee abruptly. It hesitates first. In the months following the initial inquiries, the firm's outward posture remained composed. Statements measured, timelines adjusted, assurances repeated with professional cadence. Internally, however, capital allocation began to tell a different story. Reserves thickened. Expansion budgets thinned. Optional projects were deferred, then quietly abandoned. The firm had entered a defensive liquidity stance. Clients sensed it before spreadsheets confirmed it. Sophisticated buyers of advisory services understand one immutable rule: uncertainty compounds. A delayed response becomes a missed deadline. A missed deadline becomes a governance concern. A governance concern becomes a reason to explore alternatives. And alternatives, once explored, are rarely unconsidered. The first departures were discreet: a reduction in scope here, a pause in advisory engagement there. Then came the larger recalibrations. Mandates shifted, retainers renegotiated, long-term planning outsourced elsewhere for now. The language was always temporary. The decisions never were. This is how reputations decay in professional services, not through scandal, but through inference. The firm attempted to stabilize the narrative. Thought leadership increased. Public-facing confidence was reinforced. But reputation, like compliance, is not performative. It is cumulative. And once doubt enters the system, it propagates faster than reassurance. What accelerated the process was not the audit itself, but the firm's response to it. Leadership became centralized. Decision-making narrowed. Partners who once exercised discretion now deferred upward. Velocity slowed. Clients noticed.
Under the weight of this contraction, revealed was the firm's original flaw. It had been built for acquisition, not endurance. It excelled at onboarding, branding, and momentum, but lacked the redundant systems required to absorb sustained scrutiny. Capital, always rational and aggregate, adjusted accordingly. Investors delayed. Credit tightened. Internal forecasts grew conservative. Growth narratives softened into survival narratives, then into maintenance narratives. At this stage, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the timeline remained variable. I observed none of this with satisfaction. Satisfaction implies desire. What I felt instead was recognition. The system was behaving exactly as designed, penalizing incoherence, rewarding durability, and reallocating trust towards structures that could withstand attention. The irony, of course, was exquisite. The same clients acquired through quiet opportunism were now departing through quiet prudence. No accusations, no confrontations, just decisions. And decisions, in aggregate, are verdicts.
Every professional conflict ends the same way. Not with a conversation, but with an accounting. Years after the partnership dissolution, after the firm's ambitions had been recalibrated and its footprint reduced, the final outcomes became visible. Not publicly announced, not litigated, simply observable in filings, staffing levels, and market presence. The firm survived. Survival, however, is a low bar. The audit concluded as most do, with adjustments, clarifications, reclassifications, penalties proportionate to inconsistency rather than intent. There were no headlines, no dramatic sanctions, just a permanent alteration of trajectory. What mattered more than the findings was the precedent they established. The firm would henceforth operate under heightened sensitivity, more careful, more conservative, less ambitious. Trust, once assumed, would need to be earned incrementally. Growth, once accelerated, would now be gated. This is the hidden cost of structural shortcuts. They do not always destroy firms. Sometimes they merely define them. I returned at the end to the initial breach, the silence, the disappearing clients, the illusion that relationships could be transferred without consequence. In retrospect, that silence was not absence. It was signal. It indicated a shift from relational ethics to transactional logic, from partnership to extraction. Such shifts are common. They are also revealing. The lesson here is not that tax codes are weapons or that audits are tools of retribution. The lesson is simpler and far less forgiving. Systems remember what people prefer to forget. Contracts matter, continuity matters, and compliance is not a formality, it is architecture. Those who respect it build firms that endure scrutiny. Those who bypass it build firms that cannot survive it. In closing, I will depart briefly from detachment and state my professional judgment plainly. What happened was not clever, it was not bold, it was not strategic, it was short-sighted, and the outcome predictable. Markets forgive ambition, they do not forgive incoherence, and the ledger, eventually, always balances.